Daniel Brooks had always believed that life in the city had stolen more from him than it had given. And when he finally left his architectural firm in Chicago after 30 years of relentless deadlines, design competitions, and endless battles with clients who only cared about cost efficiency, he promised himself that retirement would be different. He did not want another modern condo or a sterile apartment with neighbors on every wall. He wanted something small, genuine, tied to the earth and rooted in memory. That is why, when his uncle's old cabin by the lake in northern Michigan fell into his hands, he did not hesitate for a second. The structure itself was nothing extraordinary at first glance. Rough cedar beams darkened with age, a pitched roof that sagged slightly at the ridge, and a stone chimney patched a dozen times by different hands over the decades. Yet, to Daniel, it was more than shelter. It was a fragment of family history, a tangible reminder of the summers he had spent here as a boy when the world still felt infinite and uncomplicated. Every board carried a memory of fishing trips, smoky campfires, and evenings when his uncle would sit on the porch swing telling improbable stories that a child was willing to believe. When Daniel arrived with his modest savings, he refused to demolish the cabin or modernize it into something glossy that would look like every other house in a vacation development. He drew up his own plans, sketches that balanced preservation and reinforcement, and he began working with local carpenters to restore the structure with care. He insisted on reusing the original beams where possible, polishing them until the old resin shone again, and he kept the heavy stone hearth as the focal point of the single large room. The work was slow and at times exhausting, but it gave him a sense of purpose that he had not felt since his younger days, a reminder that architecture had once been about craft before it became about paperwork. The cabin slowly transformed into a place that was both functional and soulful, a retreat where he could live out the rest of his days without interference. Daniel was meticulous about every detail. He filed every deed, every survey, every letter connected to the property into a heavy leather binder that he kept in a locked cabinet. He studied county maps late into the night, verifying that the borders of his parcel had not changed since the 1970s when his uncle first registered the land. It amused him that even though he had retired, he could not let go of his professional instincts. He measured distances, checked alignments, and made sure the foundation stones of the cabin sat firmly within the legal limits of his lot. He enjoyed the thought that no bureaucrat, no developer, no association could ever question his right to live here. The lake community where he now lived had changed in the years since his childhood visits. Back then, there had been only a scattering of seasonal cottages, simple wooden homes like his uncle's, but the last 2 decades had brought waves of suburban expansion. What had once been quiet shoreline was now a paved street lined with nearly identical houses, most of them owned by families who spent half the year in the city. With this came the rise of a homeowners association, a board of neighbors who fancied themselves guardians of order and property values. Daniel knew of them, of course. One could not live here without at least hearing their name whispered with irritation or grudging respect, but he considered himself safe from their reach. His cabin predated the development, his property had never been enrolled in the association, and his uncle had made certain that the deeds were separate from any later incorporations. It was precisely this independence that Daniel cherished. He could paint his shutters dark green if he wished, he could plant wildflowers instead of manicured lawns, and he could watch the sunset without wondering whether some committee would find fault with the angle of his porch railing. As the months passed, Daniel fell into a rhythm that felt almost monastic in its simplicity. He would rise early, brew strong coffee, and walk down to the water's edge where the mist still clung to the surface. He spent afternoons repairing small details, replacing a cracked window pane, sanding the worn porch boards, stacking firewood with geometric precision. In the evenings he would sit by the fire with a book, the silence broken only by the distant sound of loons calling across the lake. He had few visitors, but that did not trouble him. Solitude was exactly what he wanted, and the cabin provided it in abundance. Yet beneath his contentment lay a constant awareness of fragility. Daniel had spent his career watching how power could be disguised as regulation. City inspectors who cited minor violations to push through development deals, zoning boards that bent rules for influential contractors, committees that talked of community but really meant profit. He knew how thin the line was between order and abuse, and although he trusted the solidity of his documents, a part of him feared that sooner or later someone would find a way to challenge his right to this land. The cabin was sturdy now, the stone chimney safe, the cedar walls oiled and gleaming, but all it would take was one letter in the mailbox, one claim from the association, to turn his sanctuary into a battlefield. And though he did not yet realize it, that moment was already on its way. It was a gray morning in late October when Daniel first noticed the envelope in his mailbox, and though the sight of official stationery had always carried an unpleasant weight in his professional years, he never imagined that something so small could become the spark that would consume the quiet order of his new life. The paper was heavy, embossed with the familiar but unwelcome insignia of the Lakeshore Homeowners Association, an organization he had always considered irrelevant to him, a set of neighbors playing at authority over properties they neither built nor truly understood. He carried the envelope into the cabin with his groceries, setting it on the kitchen table beside a sack of apples and a loaf of bread, and for a while he ignored it, convincing himself that it must be a mistake, or perhaps a community newsletter, inadvertently addressed to him. Yet the longer it sat there, the more it seemed to demand attention, and eventually he poured himself coffee, slit the envelope carefully with a knife, and unfolded the thick letter inside. The words, printed in that infuriatingly formal language beloved by committees, were at once absurd and threatening. The letter informed him that after a review of property boundaries, it had been determined that his cabin encroached upon common ground belonging to the association, and that in order to remain in compliance with community regulations, he would be required to relocate the structure no less than 20 feet to the east. The phrasing was cold, bureaucratic, as though moving a house were no more difficult than rearranging lawn furniture, and it was accompanied by a veiled warning that failure to comply could result in fines, legal action, and even forced removal. Daniel read the letter twice, then a third time, each repetition feeding a rising wave of incredulity and anger. The cabin had been built by his uncle half a century earlier, long before the association existed, and Daniel himself had verified every inch of the boundaries when he began his renovations. To suggest that he must now uproot the home was not only ridiculous but insulting, a declaration that his careful preparation and legal documentation meant nothing in the face of a group drunk on its own authority. At first he tried to dismiss it as an error. Perhaps the association's new surveyor had made a mistake. Perhaps the letter had been sent automatically without any real review, and he resolved to call their office that afternoon to clear up the misunderstanding. Yet, even as he set the letter aside, he felt a slow chill spread through him, a memory of countless similar moments from his career when an innocuous notice had been only the beginning of a long and punishing ordeal. He recalled the developers who would file false complaints to pressure owners into selling, the zoning boards that would reinterpret regulations in ways that benefited only the powerful, and the way ordinary people could be ground down simply because they lacked the energy or resources to fight. The thought that he might now stand in that same position, that his retreat could become a battlefield, lodged itself in his mind and refused to leave. The phone call only deepened his unease. When he reached the association office after being shuffled between secretaries who spoke with rehearsed politeness, he was finally connected to a man who identified himself as a compliance officer. Daniel explained calmly that his cabin had been built decades before the subdivision, that he possessed the original deed and survey, and that the demand to move it was based on a false assumption. The man's voice remained detached, even courteous, but there was no trace of flexibility in his words. "Our records show," he repeated more than once, "that your structure encroaches upon land designated for common use." Daniel pressed him. What records, what surveys, what authority could they possibly cite? But each time the officer retreated into formulaic answers, advising Daniel that if he wished to contest the determination he could request a formal review through the association's legal committee, a process that could take months and would not suspend the penalties for non-compliance. By the end of the call, Daniel was gripping the receiver so tightly that his knuckles whitened, and when he hung up he felt as though he had been speaking not to a person, but to a wall that absorbed his words and returned only echoes. That evening, he pulled out his binder of documents, spreading the papers across the worn surface of the dining table until the room was covered with maps, deeds, notarized letters, and photocopies of surveys old and new. He ran his finger over the lines that marked his boundaries, lines that had not changed in half a century, and he felt a grim satisfaction in their clarity. Yet, alongside the satisfaction, came unease, for he knew that truth on paper was one thing and power in practice another. If the association chose to pursue their claim, it would not matter that he possessed the stronger case. What mattered was that they had the machinery of bureaucracy at their disposal, the ability to drown him in hearings and notices until he yielded, out of exhaustion. He told himself he was not a man easily broken, but solitude was both his strength and his weakness, and he wondered whether he could endure the constant harassment that such a conflict might bring. The following days brought no relief. A second letter arrived, this one even sterner, reminding him of the deadline by which compliance must be demonstrated and attaching a schedule of fines that would be levied if he failed to act. The figures were not astronomical, but they were designed to accumulate, a slow bleed that could stretch into thousands if left unresolved. Daniel laughed bitterly when he read it, not because it was funny, but because it confirmed everything he had feared. The letter was not a mistake, not a clerical error, but a deliberate attempt to assert control over him. He could picture the board meeting where his name had been raised, the smug expressions of men and women who believed themselves custodians of order, deciding that the quiet architect in the old cabin would be an easy target. They likely assumed he would capitulate, pay the fines, perhaps even sell the land and leave, rather than endure the battle. They did not know him. Yet the knowledge that he would resist did little to calm the anxiety that crept into his days. Each time he walked the perimeter of his property, each time he stood on the porch looking out at the lake, he felt the weight of invisible eyes upon him, as though the land itself were contested ground. The neighbors still greeted him politely, but he noticed a subtle shift in their expressions, a hint of curiosity or caution, as if they already knew something of the dispute and were silently judging whether he was in the right or the wrong. Daniel understood how quickly opinion could turn in such small communities, how rumors could spread and harden into belief, and he feared that soon he would not be fighting only the board, but the entire neighborhood. One night, unable to sleep, he lit a fire and sat before the flames with the letter in his hands, reading it yet again. The absurd demand to move the cabin 20 feet glared up at him, a monument to arrogance, and he whispered aloud to the empty room that he would never do it. He would not allow them to dictate the fate of the home his uncle had built, the home he had restored with his own hands, the home that stood precisely where it was meant to stand. He had faced the pressure of clients with millions on the line. He had faced city officials who tried to twist regulations for their allies, and he had never once surrendered when he knew he was right. He would not surrender now, not to a committee of neighbors wielding clipboards and bylaws like weapons. Still, as the firelight flickered across the papers on the table, he felt the old unease settle deeper in his bones, the awareness that a battle had begun, one he had not chosen but could no longer avoid, and that before it ended, the quiet sanctuary he had built for himself might be tested in ways he had never imagined. The decision to hire a professional surveyor was not made lightly, for Daniel had long prided himself on his own precision, but he knew that if the Homeowners Association intended to press the matter, he would need independent verification that could withstand their scrutiny, and so he contacted a small local firm whose reputation for accuracy reached back 3 generations. When the team arrived one brisk morning with their tripods, lasers, and measuring rods, Daniel felt a flicker of relief, certain that within hours the entire absurdity would be put to rest. But as he watched them work with methodical care, planting markers along the edges of his land, noting each reading with clinical detachment, a sense of foreboding began to creep in. He had expected confirmation of what he already knew, yet when the surveyor returned several days later with a neatly bound report, the results were anything but routine. The document began with the expected notations, confirming the dimensions of Daniel's property as recorded in the county archives, but then it shifted into a conclusion that left him staring at the page in disbelief. Not only did his cabin sit comfortably within the rightful boundaries, but the association's paved street and a long row of houses built within the past 20 years actually intruded across his line by several yards. In other words, the very people accusing him of encroachment had themselves built an entire neighborhood partially on his land. For several minutes he could do nothing but sit at the table, the report trembling in his hands as a cold clarity settled over him. For he suddenly understood that this was no simple misunderstanding, no clerical error, but a conflict that cut to the foundation of the community itself. Armed with the report, he walked into the association's monthly meeting, a gathering held in a converted community hall where folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and the air carried the stale odor of coffee brewed too early. The residents sat murmuring among themselves until Lawrence Pike, the board's president, called the meeting to order, his voice practiced and authoritative. Daniel waited until the appropriate moment, then rose and presented his findings, laying the survey on the table with deliberate calm. At first there was silence, broken only by the shuffle of papers as Pike skimmed the pages, his brow tightening with each line, and then came the forced laugh, brittle and strained as he declared that the survey must be mistaken, that no one in E could. Their right mind would believe such an outrageous claim. Daniel stood firm, explaining the methodology, pointing to the county's original plats that matched the surveyor's conclusions, and he watched as the confidence drained from some faces in the crowd, replaced by unease and the faintest glimmer of fear. The room shifted as whispers spread, neighbors glancing at one another with dawning comprehension of what the report implied. If Daniel was correct, then entire properties, including their carefully manicured lawns, their fences, even parts of their houses, rested on land that did not belong to them, and the implications were staggering. Pike attempted to regain control, raising his voice, insisting that the matter was closed until verified by the association's own experts, but the authority that once seemed absolute now rang hollow. One man in the back muttered something about property values. A woman clutched her purse as if expecting the floor to give way, and Daniel, though calm on the surface, felt a deep shift in the balance of power, as if the ground beneath the association itself had begun to crumble. In the days that followed, the hostility became more personal. The association sent another letter, this one curt and dismissive, declaring that Daniel's survey was unofficial and irrelevant until reviewed by their chosen professionals, but the tone had sharpened, no longer bureaucratic detachment, but something closer to threat. Neighbors who had once offered polite greetings now avoided his eyes, and he could feel the invisible weight of suspicion pressing against him as though every step he took on the gravel road was being measured. One afternoon, while walking the perimeter of his lot, he noticed a fresh stake driven into the ground, painted in the bright colors used by survey crews, yet it did not match any line from the official records. Someone had quietly attempted to redraw the boundary as though repetition alone could make it truth. He removed the stake and carried it back to his porch, laying it across the steps like a piece of evidence, a reminder that the fight had moved beyond letters into the physical landscape. More troubling still was the subtle shift in atmosphere at the grocery store and post office, where Daniel overheard fragments of conversation that made clear the association was shaping a narrative against him. Words like troublemaker and opportunist drifted on the air, and though no one confronted him directly, the isolation was more suffocating than outright hostility. He recognized the tactic from his professional years. If you cannot win on facts, you undermine credibility. You plant doubt until even allies hesitate to stand beside you. It was not the open battle he had expected, but something quieter, more insidious, the kind of social erosion that could leave a man feeling outnumbered before the first shot was fired. At night, the weight pressed heavier. The cabin, once his sanctuary, now felt exposed. Every creak of the beams magnified by the thought that beyond the tree line others plotted his defeat. He could not shake the image of Pike's forced smile at the meeting, the way the man's hand had trembled slightly as he turned the pages of the survey, and he knew that such men, cornered and desperate, rarely retreated gracefully. They would fight to preserve their illusion of order, to protect the investments they had convinced others to trust, and Daniel understood that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had revealed a truth too large to ignore, and now he was not simply defending his cabin but challenging the legitimacy of an entire neighborhood. Yet beneath the fear burned something stronger, an iron resolve forged in decades of watching how power operates when unchecked. He had seen too many battles lost because ordinary people believed themselves powerless, and he would not add his name to that list. If the association wished to drag him into conflict, then so be it. He would meet them with documents, with law, with unyielding persistence. The cabin stood where it had always stood, and he would not move it. Not for a committee, not for a street, not even for a neighborhood that now seemed eager to turn against him. The first blows had been struck, but Daniel Brooks was ready, and as he extinguished the lantern one late evening, staring out into the dense blackness of the forest, he whispered to himself the promise that had carried him through many storms. They might think him alone, but truth was its own army, and it was already marching at his side. The weeks that followed the release of his independent survey report carried with them a strange duality. For on the surface, life at the cabin remained unchanged, with Daniel rising early to brew his coffee and walking the property lines that he knew so well, yet beneath that quiet routine ran a current of tension that could not be ignored. He could feel it each time he drove into town and saw the hesitant expressions of neighbors who no longer greeted him, and he could hear it in the sharp, clipped tone of the association's letters that arrived with unsettling regularity, each one a reminder that the board was not retreating, but instead tightening its grip. He spent long evenings reviewing his binder of documents, flipping through pages that had become almost too familiar until the text blurred into meaninglessness. Yet he persisted, because he knew that vigilance was the only shield he possessed. Still, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier, and when the notice arrived summoning him to a formal hearing before the association's legal committee, he understood that the battle had reached its midpoint, the stage where all pretenses of misunderstanding fell away and the confrontation became open and undeniable. The hearing was held in the community center, a low brick building that had once served as a schoolhouse and now functioned as the symbolic heart of the neighborhood. Daniel arrived early, his binder under one arm, and took a seat at the long table where the committee had arranged itself with all the pomp of a miniature courtroom. At the center sat Lawrence Pike, flanked by two board members who avoided Daniel's gaze, while a young attorney in a tailored suit shuffled papers with theatrical precision. Residents filled the folding chairs at the back, their faces a mosaic of curiosity, fear, and hostility, and the murmur of their whispers echoed off the high ceiling until Pike banged a gavel to call for order. The proceeding began with a recitation of the alleged violation, the same language that had haunted the letters. Daniel Brooks' cabin was said to encroach upon common property, and unless rectified, the association was within its rights to enforce compliance through fines and legal remedies. The words were delivered with a detached authority, yet Daniel could not help but notice the flicker of unease in Pike's eyes, a tremor that betrayed more than his steady voice suggested. When it was Daniel's turn to respond, he rose slowly, placed his binder on the table, and opened it with deliberate care, the sound of the metal rings snapping echoing through the room like a challenge. He began not with anger but with measured explanation, walking the committee step by step through the history of his property, the original deed signed by his uncle, the county records that matched the dimensions, and, finally, the independent survey that had confirmed everything beyond doubt. As he laid each document on the table, sliding it toward the attorney, the crowd leaned forward, and Daniel felt the shift in the room as the truth became harder to deny. When he reached the conclusion, the revelation that it was not his cabin but the very street and homes of the association that encroached upon his land, the silence was profound, broken only by the rustle of someone shifting uncomfortably in their chair. Pike's face had hardened into a mask, but the strain was visible in the tightness of his jaw and the way his hand gripped the gavel as though it alone kept him in control. The attorney attempted to dismiss the survey, suggesting it was unofficial and possibly flawed, yet Daniel countered calmly by producing a copy of county maps from the 1950s, retrieved at his own expense from the archives. These maps, stamped and certified, clearly showed the boundaries long before the subdivision was built, and when he placed them side by side with the survey, the conclusion was unavoidable. The association's development had crossed into land that never belonged to it. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience, and Daniel seized the moment to speak not only as a property owner, but as a man who had spent his career ensuring the integrity of structures and spaces. He explained that while houses could be built with care and roads could be paved with precision, none of it mattered if the foundation of ownership was corrupt, and what they faced now was not a matter of aesthetics or compliance, but a question of legitimacy. The effect on the crowd was immediate. Some residents turned to one another with visible alarm, whispering about what this could mean for their mortgages, their resale values, even the legality of their very homes. A woman in the second row stood up, demanding to know whether her backyard playground sat on stolen land, while an older man shouted that he had paid taxes for decades and wanted to know why no one had noticed this before. Pike attempted to restore order, his voice rising, insisting that the matter was still under review and that no conclusions could be drawn until the association completed its own investigation. Yet the veneer of control had cracked, and for the first time Daniel saw not a unified body but a community on the edge of fracture. What unsettled him most, however, was not the outrage of the residents but the quiet glances exchanged between Pike and the attorney, looks that suggested a shared understanding of something unsaid. It was not disbelief that troubled them but recognition, as if they already knew the truth of Daniel's claims and were now scrambling to conceal it. The realization chilled him. This was not a mistake born of incompetence, but a deception sustained by willful silence, and he wondered how many meetings, how many quiet deals, had been made to bury the inconvenient reality of those boundaries. That night, lying awake in his cabin, he replayed the hearing in his mind, the voices of his neighbors rising into angry confusion, and he understood that the battle was no longer about moving a cabin 20 feet, but about exposing a fraud that threatened to unravel the very fabric of the community. In the following days, the consequences became clearer. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards around town, unsigned but clearly written by someone within the association, warning that Daniel's claims threatened property values and urging residents to stand united against his false accusations. At the same time, a few neighbors approached him quietly, not in solidarity but in desperation, asking whether it was true, whether their houses might be built on land that belonged to him, their eyes betraying both fear and the faint hope that he might reassure them. He told them only what he knew, no more, for he understood that anything he said could be twisted and repeated, and he did not wish to provide ammunition to the board. Yet each conversation deepened his awareness of how precarious the situation had become, and how far the association might go to preserve its illusion of order. One evening, as he returned from town, he found a letter pinned to his porch with a thumbtack, not in the association's official envelope, but scrawled in hurried handwriting. It contained no greeting, no signature, only the words, You don't know what you're stirring up. Stop before it's too late. Daniel read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it with the others in his binder, for he had no intention of discarding even the smallest piece of evidence. But, as he sat by the fire that night, the note burned in his mind, a reminder that he was no longer fighting only through documents and hearings, but had entered a realm where fear and intimidation would become weapons. He told himself he would not be frightened. The truth was his defense, yet he also knew that battles fought in shadows could be more dangerous than those fought in courtrooms. By the midpoint of the conflict, Daniel found himself standing not just against a board of neighbors, but against the weight of an entire system built on convenience, denial, and silence. His evidence was strong, his reasoning unassailable, yet power rarely bowed to truth without a fight, and he sensed that the fight had only just begun. The cracks were visible now, in Pike's strained expressions, in the unease of the residents, in the whispers that filled the town. But cracks alone did not bring down structures. They had to be widened, pried apart, until the edifice collapsed under the weight of its own falsehood, and Daniel knew it was this task that now lay before him. The weeks after the hearing settled into a rhythm of unease, as though every day carried with it some new reminder that Daniel's position had shifted from quiet resident to open adversary. And while the Homeowners Association no longer bothered with polite language in their correspondence, the pressure they applied now came in subtler, more insidious forms that revealed a strategy designed not only to dispute his claims, but to wear him down in spirit. The first sign appeared when he returned from a trip to town and discovered that his mailbox, a sturdy iron fixture that had stood undisturbed for years, had been pried open, its door bent awkwardly as though forced with a crowbar. Inside lay no letters, only a scrap of paper on which someone had scrawled the words, "Pay what you owe," in thick black marker. He reported the vandalism to the post office, but they could do little beyond suggesting he replace the box, and when he raised the matter with the local police, the officer on duty nodded sympathetically, yet wrote so little on the incident report that Daniel suspected it would vanish into a drawer and never be seen again. Soon afterward, he began receiving notices from the county sanitation department, each citing alleged violations regarding waste disposal and demanding fines for leaving trash bins in unauthorized locations or failing to secure them properly. Daniel had never once failed to follow the rules of collection, and in fact his meticulous habits ensured that his bins were aligned neatly at the roadside, but the notices kept arriving, each one more aggressive than the last, until he realized that someone within the association had filed repeated complaints under his name. He appealed each violation, providing photographs and statements, yet the process consumed hours of his time, hours that left him weary and frustrated. It was not the money that troubled him, though the fines were designed to sting, but the deliberate erosion of his energy, the attempt to drown him in trivialities until he lost the will to fight on matters that truly mattered. At night he began hearing unfamiliar sounds beyond the tree line, the crack of branches underfoot and the low rumble of engines idling on the road, and though he never caught anyone in the act, he suspected that members of the board or their allies had taken to patrolling near his cabin, not out of genuine concern for safety but as a display of presence, a reminder that he was being watched. One morning he discovered fresh tire tracks pressed deep into the mud near the edge of his property, tracks that did not match his own vehicle and led to nowhere but a dead end against the fence line. The message was clear. Others had been here, and they wanted him to know it. He documented everything with photographs, storing them alongside his growing collection of letters and reports, and while part of him wondered if he was overreacting, the accumulation of evidence suggested a campaign carefully calibrated to unsettle him. The association, meanwhile, shifted tactics in their official communications. They no longer spoke of moving his cabin 20 feet. Instead, they accused him of obstructing community cohesion, of making reckless claims that threatened property values, and of creating hostility among neighbors. Their latest letter warned that if he did not withdraw his assertions and accept a revised boundary agreement, an agreement that effectively ceded part of his land to the association, they would consider him in violation of their code of conduct and pursue legal remedies that could include liens against his property. Daniel read the letter in silence, marveling at the audacity of a board that claimed jurisdiction over land it had never owned, and he understood that what began as an absurd demand had evolved into an attempt to rewrite the reality of ownership itself. They were no longer simply defending themselves, they were attempting to erase his rights entirely. The hostility of neighbors, too, became harder to ignore. A woman who once exchanged small talk with him at the store now turned her back, and a man he had helped dig out after a snowstorm last winter muttered under his breath as Daniel passed. On more than one occasion he overheard conversations in which his name was invoked with contempt, as though he were a saboteur bent on destroying the neighborhood. The rumors spread with astonishing speed. Some claimed he intended to sue every homeowner for trespass, others insisted he planned to bulldoze sections of the road, and a few suggested he was plotting to sell his land to developers who would evict them all. None of it was true, yet the repetition of lies had its effect, isolating him further, until even the occasional sympathetic glance seemed tinged with suspicion. The pressure reached a new intensity when his surveyor, the independent professional whose report had first revealed the encroachment, contacted him to say that he could no longer participate in the dispute. The man's voice was strained over the phone, his words halting as he explained that he had received threatening calls late at night, anonymous voices warning him to stay out of community business. Though he would not name names, it was obvious that someone aligned with the association had orchestrated the intimidation, and Daniel felt a surge of guilt for dragging the man into a conflict he had not sought. Without his testimony, the board no doubt hoped Daniel's case would weaken, but instead it strengthened his resolve, for the cruelty of the tactic made clear that they feared the truth enough to silence those who spoke it. Daniel responded not with retreat, but with quiet preparation. He redoubled his efforts to gather documents, visiting the county courthouse to request older plats, and speaking with clerks who remembered the subdivision's formation. He discovered discrepancies in the filing dates, small but suspicious irregularities that hinted at corners being cut when the development first took shape, and while he could not yet prove deliberate fraud, he sensed that the history of the neighborhood contained shadows long concealed. Each discovery fueled him with new determination, even as the atmosphere around him grew darker, and he began to see himself less as a man defending a cabin and more as one exposing a corruption that had festered too long. By the time winter's first snow dusted the lake and the roofs of the surrounding houses, Daniel knew that the conflict had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. He was no longer simply the target of bureaucratic pressure, but the victim of coordinated harassment designed to break him. The mailbox, the false fines, the tire tracks, the threats against his surveyor, all of it formed a pattern that revealed the association's true fear, that his evidence was unassailable, and that their power would collapse if he persisted. And so, though the nights grew longer and the silence around his cabin more oppressive, Daniel whispered to himself that he would not yield, for the ground beneath his feet was not only his by law, but his by right, and no committee of frightened neighbors could strip it from him without a fight that would leave them exposed for what they truly were. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the hearing, not because the case of Daniel Brooks against the Lakeshore Homeowners Association was officially high profile, but because word had spread through the community like wildfire, and curiosity had drawn residents who now understood that their own stability might be shaken by whatever was decided. Daniel sat at the petitioner's table, his binder of documents stacked neatly before him, the pages worn from endless handling yet still crisp with authority. Across the aisle, Lawrence Pike and the association's attorney whispered to one another in hushed tones, their faces stiff with forced confidence, as though the performance of composure could conceal the unease that lurked in their eyes. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a reputation for blunt pragmatism, called the session to order, and the room fell silent with the kind of anticipation that vibrates like a taut wire. The association presented its case first, arguing with the familiar language of authority that Daniel's cabin violated boundary regulations, insisting that his independent survey was unverified and his claims exaggerated. The attorney produced diagrams prepared by their own hired surveyor, charts that conveniently realigned the property lines in ways that excused the association's encroachment and placed the supposed burden back onto Daniel. For a while, the presentation seemed polished, even persuasive, and murmurs from the gallery suggested that some residents felt relief in the neatness of the association's story. Yet, when Daniel's turn came, he rose slowly, adjusting his glasses, and spoke with the quiet precision of a man who had spent his life in architecture, explaining that structures must be measured not by convenience but by truth, and that no amount of redrawn diagrams could erase the reality embedded in decades of official maps. He laid out his evidence step by step, beginning with the original deed from the 1970s, followed by county plats certified by public offices long before the association was even conceived, and finally the independent survey that aligned perfectly with those historical records. The judge leaned forward, studying each document as Daniel slid them across the table, her brow furrowing as the weight of consistency became undeniable. But the true turning point came when Daniel introduced an unexpected piece of evidence he had uncovered during his quiet research, a set of municipal records showing that during the subdivision's formation, certain maps had been filed with dates that did not correspond to official approvals, suggesting that they had been altered after the fact to legitimize construction already underway. The room stirred at the implication, and when Daniel calmly pointed out that the association's street and several of its houses had been built on land that legally belonged to his parcel, the silence that followed was more damning than any outburst could have been. Pike shifted uneasily, his composure cracking, and the attorney attempted to object, claiming irrelevance, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand, demanding clarification. Daniel obliged, presenting copies of correspondence from the municipal office in which questions about the boundary were raised decades earlier and then abruptly dismissed without resolution, as if buried under pressure from eager developers. It became evident that the problem was not new, that it had been deliberately ignored to allow the neighborhood to flourish, and now the truth had returned, undeniable and impossible to suppress. A murmur swelled among the residents seated in the gallery, some faces pale with shock, others flushed with anger, and a woman near the back whispered loudly enough to be heard, "They knew all along." The judge delivered her decision with deliberate clarity, her voice steady as she declared that the association's claims against Daniel were unfounded, that his cabin stood entirely within his lawful property, and that the burden of encroachment lay instead with the association itself. She ordered an immediate suspension of all penalties levied against him and referred the matter to the county prosecutor for investigation into potential fraudulent filings during the subdivision's creation. The words struck the room like a hammer, shattering the illusion of authority that Pike and his allies had clung to, and in that moment the association's carefully maintained facade collapsed under the weight of its own deceit. Daniel exhaled slowly, not in triumph but in exhausted relief, for he knew the fight was not over, that investigations and negotiations would stretch into the future, but he had stood his ground, and the law had affirmed what he had always known. The Iushius cabin was his, the land was his, and no committee could strip it away through lies. As he left the courtroom, residents avoided his gaze, some out of shame, others out of fear, and Pike remained seated at the table staring down at the polished wood as if unable to comprehend the ruin of his authority. Daniel walked into the cold afternoon air, the binder still under his arm, and though the world outside seemed unchanged, the weight on his chest had lifted. He had faced the full power of the association in their chosen arena and emerged unbroken, and that victory, however costly, marked the climax of a battle that had threatened to erase his sanctuary. Now the truth was out, and nothing could return it to silence. In the weeks after the ruling, the neighborhood that had once seemed so solid began to fracture under the weight of revelation. For while Daniel had secured his own position, the decision left many residents facing the grim truth that parts of their homes, their driveways, even the very street they drove on every morning, rested on land that was never legally theirs. Meetings turned chaotic. Neighbors who once parroted the board's authority now demanded answers, and whispers of lawsuits multiplied until the community hall was filled with more suspicion than solidarity. Lawrence Pike resigned quietly, slipping away without a speech or apology, leaving behind a board stripped of legitimacy and residents scrambling to understand what would happen next. For Daniel, the aftermath carried no sweetness of triumph, only the weary satisfaction of knowing that his cabin would remain standing exactly where it had always stood, untouchable now, not by chance, but by the firm weight of law. Some neighbors came to him in awkward truce, speaking cautiously, asking if he would be willing to negotiate easements or partial sales that could stabilize their titles, and though Daniel held every advantage, he chose not to wield it with cruelty. He agreed to discussions, but only on terms that acknowledged his rights fully, making clear that what had been dismissed as eccentric stubbornness was in fact the foundation of the truth. Others avoided him altogether, unable to reconcile the image of the quiet architect with the man who had pulled back the curtain on a deception they had unknowingly relied upon for decades. He did not begrudge their silence, for he understood that anger and shame were difficult companions, and he no longer sought their approval. As winter deepened and the lake froze into stillness, Daniel returned to his routines, stacking wood by the porch, repairing shutters, walking the familiar perimeter of his land with the certainty that no one could now challenge what was his. The cabin, once threatened, now stood as a symbol of endurance, its beams dark against the snow, its hearth burning steady at night. He did not think of himself as a hero, nor as a conqueror, but simply as a man who refused to be erased, and in that refusal he had forced the truth into daylight where it could not be hidden again. In the silence of the evenings when the fire cracked and the wind howled against the cedar walls, Daniel felt something close to peace, knowing that though the community around him might never fully forgive or forget, the land beneath his feet belonged to him alone, and that was enough.